Chapter 8 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Chapter 8. The Back Trail Among the Aymara. At first, the plateau was dotted with the lines of converging burro and llama trains, but as the morning passed, there was nothing but the lonely distance of the plateau, with here and there a tiny speck of a solitary pack train. The air had warmed rapidly under the sun. The light breeze had the touch of a northern spring, and I yielded to the seductive suggestion and strapped my heavy woolen coat to the saddle. 5 minutes later I halted and gladly put it on once more, for the thin air was treacherous in its allurements. Somewhere about the middle of the day we halted for breakfast at Cocuta, a native tambo or wayside inn, though the pack train pushed on slowly, nibbling the bunch grass as it went. The tambo was surrounded by a high, thick mud brick wall that enclosed something over an acre of ground, and inside this fortress were the little mud buildings, granaries, and corrals. An old Aymara woman cooked our breakfast over a llama dung fire in one corner of the room, and it was served on a rough table over by a dried mud bench that was built against two of the walls. The filthy room was lighted only by the small, low doors, the high mud sills of which still further shut out light and ventilation, and the fetid atmosphere was rich in its ethnological and entomological suggestion. A chicken soup, reeking with the mutton tallow of Calona, and with the head and feet of the fowl floating in the grease, made the first course. Then came lomita, the tenderloin of a steak, and eggs fried in mutton tallow. We produced some coffee from the saddlebags, and the old woman fluttered about and brewed a pretty fair article. It was at this same Cocuta, on another occasion, that in riding to La Paz I ran into a band of drunken ladrones, and as some of the band took the trail after me, it gave a most unwelcome and interesting zest to the rest of that night ride. That night we slept in a second tambo, smaller, but also with a thick mud wall enclosing the collection of mud huts. The mules were turned loose on the plateau to graze till morning, their hobbled feet a guarantee of their not straying. At sunset came the piercing cold, when even the barricaded door of the mudroom and the steaming human warmth inside proved grateful. A wide platform of mud bricks was the bed. It was the sole furniture, and on it we piled the sheepskins from the pack saddles, and over an alcohol lamp we made a thin tea and warmed up some tinned things. An old Aymara woman was apparently the sole caretaker of this tambo, but she viewed us with unlovely eyes and would furnish nothing. Sullen and surly that night, she was all ingratiating smiles the next morning when she saw my camera. She scuttled inside her hut, and then reappeared in some hasty finery, in which she trotted anxiously about with conciliatory grimaces and pleadings in guttural Aymara that her picture be taken. How she knew what a camera was for, and further why she was not afraid of it, were mysteries, for invariably I found all other Aymara hostile against the evil witchcraft of the little black box. As it was yet only early dawn, there was not sufficient light, but I satisfied her by clicking the shutter. After the heated air in the dark hut, the first moment outside in the pure, still cold was like breathing needles. The long stretch of plateau was soft with white frost. Every grimy straw in the thatched roofs glistened like silver with its coating of ice, and the morning ablutions were performed through a hole broken in the crust of ice in a nearby brook. A cup of tea boiled over the alcohol lamp was the only breakfast, and then we started. As we climbed into the saddles, the old Aymara woman hovered in the gateway, clucking pleased Aymara benedictions for her photograph. For some reason of his own, Rodriguez elected to leave the main trail beyond this tambo and take one of the little used back trails to Sorata. It was very much shorter, but, as we afterward learned, is little used on account of the surly, hostile attitude of the Aymara of that district, and, except for a large outfit, is not considered safe. Here the Aymara are more secluded, and view intrusion with aggressive suspicion. 3 months before, they had attacked an outfit and killed the trader. Those who passed no longer greeted us with the ta-ta. Instead, they would turn sullenly out of the trail to avoid us as we passed, or stop and view us with unmistakable hostility. When we halted for a hasty bite by the side of a cold brook, Rodriguez held the whole pack train and the arrieros close by, and did not allow them to go ahead, as on the day before. Just before branching off into this unused trail, we came upon a large party of Aymara, carrying in relays a stretcher on their shoulders that was enclosed with cloth, so that it resembled a sort of palanquin. 6 of them were carrying it at a time in a ground-eating dog trot, and about each half-mile they would be relieved by 6 others, the transfer of the stretcher being effected without jolt or jar. It proved to be a wealthy Bolivian haciendado who was ill, and was being carried in this simple ambulance to the doctors in La Paz by his own Indians. The trot and the burden were nothing to them. I have seen an Aymara boy carry 40 pounds on his back, and trot hour after hour without apparent difficulty, and come into camp at night but little behind the mounted man he was accompanying. Yet at this altitude, unless one has become gradually accustomed, even walking is a heavy effort. On the new trail, the dead level of the plateau gave way to more rolling country. The ragged, snow-capped line of mountains at the horizon came closer. Huayna Potosi loomed on our right, and growing more impressive every hour was the great white mass of Mount Sorata dead ahead. Then the rolling country closed in, and narrower valleys succeeded, with the rugged foothills on each side. In this part was an enormous breeding ground for llamas. For miles the hills were dotted with them. Baby llamas, very new, and still blinking at the strange world, huddled timidly in behind a tuft of bunch grass, or behind some small boulder, while the queer, goose-necked mother stood near with apparent indifference. Little llamas in all stages of adolescence and awkwardness gamboled on the hillsides, and herds dotting the slopes looked for all the world like big, stiff-necked, grotesque sheep. Among them were the Aymara herders, who, like traditional shepherds, played their weird and mournful flutes or pipes. Over and over again came the same strain, which carried for miles in the thin, still air. One of its little phrases curiously reminded me of that chanted taunt of my boyhood, "Over the fence is out." Rarely does the Aymara make his own flute or pipe, simple though it is. Their manufacture is a native industry by itself. Like a true musician, the Aymara must have his instrument just so, and up in the higher altitudes the flutes are made and brought down to be sold in the market on the days of fiesta. His single weapon, a sling of the pattern made famous by David and Goliath, is of twisted llama wool, and will throw a stone the size of a lemon. They develop a wonderful skill in its use. On this lonely trail we came upon a castle, a veritable castle of the storybooks. Alone, grim and battlemented, it stood boldly outlined against the landscape. It was not large, but it was, or had been, perfect in every medieval detail, and was constructed of mud bricks from outer walls to keep. There was a moat, dry and unkept, and now fallen upon evil days. The high surrounding wall was loopholed, and the fringe of battlements had been eaten away in places by the driving storms. The keep was visible rising above the wall, while galleries and overhanging balconies showed the purposes and possibilities of protection, even should the outer wall be successfully stormed by some ancient foe. The single heavy outer gate in the wall was barred, and not a sign of life or of a retainer was to be seen. For miles around, the country was deserted and bare, and in the desolate mountains remained the substance of the past, like a grim, dramatic ghost of ancient days. Back on this unused trail it is but little known. Rodriguez knew of it, but that was all, except that he had a very positive idea that its owner or occupant did not care for visitors, but it was occupied. Monotonously through the afternoon the pack train wound through the narrow valleys, and closer came the mountains, and more chill the air sweeping downward from their fields of snow. The melting snows flooded the slopes and valleys in innumerable brooks. Often the trail itself was lost in wide expanses of icy water. The sun set, and with growing darkness came the increased bitterness of the piercing cold. Along this trail there was no shelter except here and there the little mud huts of the Aymara. The clouds rolling low overhead left the night pitch black. A gale of wind sprang up and hurled itself in our teeth, varying its monotony now and again with a squall of snow that stung like a blizzard. Without a stumble, the sure-footed mules kept the trail in the darkness up and down through abrupt gullies, or fording some icy stream that left their bellies a fringe of icicles, while, during some lull in the blast, the tinkle of the bell on the leading pack animal would drift back to us. At last the old deserted tambo for which we had been aiming was reached. By the aid of a few matches, for the lantern was carefully packed on some mule indistinguishable in the blackness, half a dozen Aymara were found sleeping in the litter on the floor of the mudroom, for here there was not even a mud bench. There was no barricade to close the door, and a score of eddies whirled in from the broken thatch overhead. The arrieros drove the Aymara out. They were part of a pack train, and not natives of that district, and threw the sheepskin pads over the muddy ground. The alcohol lamp, screened from drafts by saddles, sheepskins, and hats, finally furnished a lukewarm tin of soup, some thin warm tea, and some eggs, which, though warm, could hardly be considered cooked. The bitter wind swept through the openings, and no candle could survive. So purely by a sense of touch, the frozen spurs and puttees were unbuckled for the instant sleep that came, clothes and all. At the break of day we were again in the saddle. The trail the previous day had been hard and rough, but following a general level. But from now on it began steadily to rise. Early in the morning we had gained upon Mount Sorata. In the deceptive distance it loomed apparently only a few miles ahead, yet its nearest snowfield was 30 miles away. Lake Titicaca is only a few miles distant, and one of its long arms reaches back into the country in a vast, shallow lagoon covered with a water growth through which swim myriads of fearless waterfowls. In some ancient time a causeway was built over this long arm, solid and substantial, and on each side, as we passed over, ducks and snipe and waders eyed us impudently, the length of a fishing rod away, and one, a snipe, flickered along almost under the heels of the pack mules. Off in the distance was the old Aymara city of Aquicachi, still surrounded by the remains of an old mud wall that dates from before Pizarro, where the frosted thatch and tile roofs glittered in the sunlight against the distant cold blue horizon of Lake Titicaca. Beyond the causeway the trail rose steadily to the mountain pass. The cold mists from Sorata swept down, and the line of mules disappeared in its chill fog. It thins, slender wraiths of eddying vapor drift past, and we ride through the ruins of an ancient Aymara town, where there was nothing left but the rectangular lines of stone debris. The few streets were still plainly marked, though the village has been dead these many centuries. Its name is lost, it is not even a tradition. From under some ruined rubbish an Aymara head was thrust out, framed in the acrid, thin smoke from the wretched makeshift hut. A few sheep were herded within the ruined enclosures, and other small flocks were grazing near. The head proved to belong to their shepherd, tending them until the time of their transmutation into Kalona. Now and again an Aymara shrine loomed through the mist beside the trail. In its niche an offering of wilted flowers and some cigarette pictures, and above, in a crevice of the stones and dried mud, a crooked twig cross. Sometimes we met an Aymara, with a bundle of reeds, sitting in the shelter of a rough stone windbreak, making and testing his reed flutes. He whittled the reed and tested each finger hole as he scraped it larger. He looked up, and again we were saluted with the respectful "ta-ta," for in order to reach the last stage of the mountain pass, we had swung back on the main trail, where the Indians were more sociable. More stone and mud shrines appeared, each with its offering of propitiation to the gods of these higher places, and each with its twig cross above. Higher, rougher, and steeper grew the trail, often in a zigzag up some precipitous gorge. A tiny, scattering Indian village came in sight, Huelata, perched on a high, rolling part of this Andean pass. Its mud huts were smaller, grimier, and drearier, if possible, than those that we had passed on the great plateau. A few Aymara appeared and tried to sell us cibada, or barley, for the mules. An old woman, squatting on the ground, weaving a poncho on her log loom, stopped long enough to look over our cavalcade curiously out of her bleared eyes red with smoke. Through the little door of her hut the interior was visible, stacked with Kalona half prepared, and waiting for the sun to shine before it was moved out into the open ground for further drying. Indifferently she watched me extract the camera from my saddlebag, but when the brass lens pointed in her direction, she clattered vigorously in her dialect and scuttled into the house to hide. The other Aymara were instantly hostile, and I worked a scheme that had often succeeded. I turned my back to them and reversed the camera, with the lens pointing backward under my arm. This would almost invariably get the picture. If it did not, I would stand behind the broad shoulders of one of the party while I adjusted the camera, and then have him step suddenly to one side as I pressed the button. Otherwise they would scatter like a flock of Chinamen under similar conditions and with angry mutterings. End of Chapter 8.